I'm Cobie Smulders, like the voice in the sky just said, and I am a Save the Children ambassador. And I'm honored to introduce this panel discussion on one of the most pressing issues of our time, water insecurity. We now have groundbreaking tools that help measure water insecurity caused by climate change, and they show us that around the world, communities who are already challenged by inequities and discrimination disproportionately lack access to water that can be used safely for drinking, cooking, sanitation, and water-based hygiene. Over the next half hour, we'll hear from experts who will share their insights on the challenges and opportunities of addressing water insecurity. We'll learn about innovative solutions that are making a difference, as well as the ongoing barriers that we must overcome. But the conversation that we are having today in this room is not enough. We have to take action. We must urge policymakers at all levels to prioritize access to clean water. This means investing in infrastructure and technology to ensure that everyone has access to safe water no matter where they live. We also need to address the root causes of water insecurity, such as the climate crisis, unsustainable practices, and pollution. By working together, we can ensure a sustainable future where the availability of safe-to-use water is a reality for every child. Join me in supporting the critical work of organizations like Save the Children and in advocating for policies that prioritize access to safe water for all. So thank you again for being here this morning, and please welcome our panelists.
Hello again, everyone, and hello to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. I am really excited about this conversation. It's a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention. As Cobie was just mentioning, there is such an issue related to water scarcity that transcends all aspects of our lives. Today, over 2 billion people lack access to clean water. And if you think about how that reverberates through our lives, think about how it impacts industry, how it impacts health, how it impacts security. It touches everything, and we don't talk about it enough. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation today and just thrilled to be in dialogue with the three of you who are working intimately on all of these issues and have unique perspectives on it. Not only the problem, but more importantly, what needs to be done. And so thanks again for joining us. I want to encourage everyone to submit questions, and if you're online, submit them through the platform. But let's dive in. So, Sera, I'd like to start with you. You have been working doggedly on this issue for many years. And, you know, some of the things that were mentioned earlier today and actually in the last panel is about data. If we can't measure it, we can't manage it, we don't understand it. And so can you provide a little bit of a perspective on the scope of the problem and the work that you've been doing specifically to understand the nature of the problem and how it's affecting people's lives?
Sure. So water security is a term that covers all manner of sins. I mean, there's sort of 4 domains when you think about water security. Is it physically available? Can you get to it? You get to it, so that's the access part. Do you have it for everything that you need it for? So that's the use part. And then is it reliable? And what I have seen from my fieldwork globally is that we're pretty good at measuring physical availability. You can speak more to that. We have some sense of availability in the sense of measuring infrastructure, but we're missing that last mile. We haven't been measuring if people have the water that they need for all the aspects of their life and if it's reliable. And that's where my team comes in. So we've developed the Water Insecurity Experiences scales, which are 12 items, 3 minutes, and they stand up through all of the statistics and theory and field testing to show that these data can generate really important information that tells us if people are, in fact, water secure.
And I understand you're just coming back from Mexico.
Yes. So it was a fantastic meeting there where we were getting people together, people who cared about water, but maybe more importantly, because water use touches on sanitation, hygiene, of course, but it also touches on nutrition. It also touches on infectious disease. It also touches on economic well-being. So what we did is we pulled together leaders from FAO, UNICEF, World Food Program, and governmental leaders. We got together and we said, we need to harmonize how we're understanding and measuring water security. And we came to agreement that this is the way forward.
I'm really fascinated about the approach and focus on experiential factors. How's it impacting people's lives and their experience? Yeah. Want to dive into that a little bit more. Turning over it to you, Janti. I know you have some perspective on this as well, but from Kenya, and understand that you've been doing work there on the ground, and would love to hear a little bit more from you about your work with Save the Children, and specifically your travel to Kenya and how you are seeing water scarcity issues manifest there.
Sure. Look, Save the Children works in 115, 116 countries all across the world, 25,000 staff, and we reach hundreds of millions of children. But if you look at the impact of the lack of water access, use, etc., the power dynamics around water use, it impacts children not in the future, but now, right? If there is no water in the school, there is no latrines, guess what happens when girls get their periods? They miss out on school. They miss 40 days per year easily on school. That translates into years of less education than their counterparts. We see half of the healthcare clinics that Save the Children works in, and worldwide, that's data that we do have no water and soap. So can you imagine that you're a mom giving birth in a clinic and there is no water and soap? So we see it every day in our work manifest. So we went to Kenya 2 weeks ago. We brought along 6 congressmen and women to effectively show them the impact of US leadership, US funding, and investment behind some of our interventions. And if you go to northern Kenya, Turkana, it's one of the, you land and you see this massive Lake Turkana, which is this massive body of water, which is salty, brackish, and then it's essentially a desert. And Kenya, as well as Somalia, have had 5 failed rains. It's the worst drought in 40 years. So there's literally not been a drop of rain in that place for over 2 years. So that means most of the people there who survive because they're pastoralists, so they roam, they're nomadic, they have animals. 2.5 million animals died. They've lost their livelihoods, their income, their ability to send their kids to school, etc., etc. So massive impact of lack of water, of reliable water, because even when there then is once in a while a bit of an unexpected rain, it turns into a flash flood because the ground is so dry that it won't absorb it, and then it literally it also kills animals. So animals get killed because of drought or because they're flushed away in a flood. So we saw all of that, and then of course if you want to be in a healthcare clinic and make sure that moms can give birth safely, if you want to work with pastoralists and help them farm so that they can actually regain their income, if you want to work with women entrepreneurs and help them set up a small business, and those are all the things that we were doing there with some of our great partners, you also need to make sure that there is some sustainable access and use of water. Now, there are people sometimes think, oh, it's too difficult, it's too expensive, it's in a desert anyway. But we've seen there on the ground there are actually cost-effective solutions, and they're being, there's innovation happening all the time as well. You can do rainwater harvesting if there is rain, right? There are still places it's rain. It's unpredictable. Sometimes it's on and off. But if you have good harvesting mechanisms in place, you can actually at least use that to have it. There's phenomenal. Yes, you can do boreholes. There's a phenomenal technique now. I'm certainly not a water expert, so somebody can hold me honest here. But where you actually capture rain and you can almost turn it into a reverse borehole. So you then store it underground. So there are ways to do this effectively. You can do it for individual households and make it more accessible for them, or for schools. Mm-hmm. You can put sensors on schools and understand when rain is coming so that you're ready for it. So I do think there is now so much more available that we're not always putting to good use. And I would say we are delighted with Sera's work. We're trying to incorporate it now into the work that we do, because for us that data is super important.
Absolutely, and would love to dive into that in a moment as well. And you're in luck because we have a hydrologist on the stage as well. So would like to dive into that too. But I'm curious too, this was part of a congressional delegation you mentioned, and so curious about those priorities and how you see that partnership as being critical to informing policy. And then I'd like to come over to you, Annalise, working with the Department of Interior and tying that into priorities for the U.S. and this administration with the water strategy that was recently released.
Yeah, look, it was great to travel with members of Congress. When you travel, you have lots of opportunity to talk about lots of things, but also to bring them, you know, to have them see up close and personal the impact of the work. We went to this area in Navasha where we're working with smallholder farmers and also really young farmers. Let's not forget that 70% of the population of Kenya is under 25, right? So we met young people who were farming. U.S. investment helps them adapt to droughts and more unpredictable rainy seasons, more drought-resistant crops, better irrigation, understanding soil techniques, helping them essentially, you know, weather-proofing some of their farming, and then also an investment in the private sector to make sure that they can link up their produce and get decent contracts with a local Kenyan company who can then export it. Essentially, this went to Europe, which I realize for climate is not always great, but it does create a sustainable business for a Kenyan company, which employs thousands of people, and it creates reliability and an export market for local farmers, as well as their domestic use.
And those examples are so important. We were talking about some earlier in terms of what can be done, what exists, what's already being able to be implemented, and there's a return on investment. There's value there in many respects, in many sectors. And I'd like to turn to the hydrologist to my left and bring you in. You know, I think you have such a fascinating background, Annalise, and you're coming from, you know, now at Interior, previously DOD, and a hydrologist and a scientist and a data nerd who I'm very excited to be among. I hope you don't mind me saying that.
Love it.
And just really excited to hear from your perspective of how you're thinking about these challenges as they pertain to the interior and the role of policy, understanding there are so many of these cascading impacts for health, economic development, and security. How is that translating into the administration's policy and the priorities that you have now in your work?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely a data nerd, so always supportive of that. Yeah, I mean, I think I just kind of want to start off by saying I think it's so important we're talking about water security here at this climate summit today, because we cannot address the climate crisis if we don't talk about water security. They're intrinsically linked. Both for adaptation and mitigation of climate change, we need to be talking about water. Adaptation, we're seeing the majority of the risks of the climate change impacts, floods, droughts, sea level rise, they're usually water-related risks. And then when it comes to mitigation, hydropower is a huge source of renewable energy, one of the oldest that we have, and a really important source around the world. And if we're not managing our water resources well, managing our reservoirs, we lose out on the source, on hydropower. And so we need to make sure, I think a huge piece of it is thinking about the way water, climate, health, all of these different things, ecosystems are interconnected. And so when we're trying to work on solving one of those issues, we're thinking about how they're connected to all of those other challenges and security risks and environmental security kind of more broadly. And I think it's exciting to be part of the Biden-Harris administration, as we've talked about so far, really recognizes the urgency of these intersecting crises and the impact to local and marginalized communities. And just last Friday, President Biden announced a new executive order on our commitment to environmental justice for all. So recommend that you check that out if you haven't seen that already. And domestically, so the Department of Interior, also last week, the Bureau of Reclamation just announced their climate change adaptation strategy. And so that's really going to be important for guiding the Bureau for using leading science and engineering to inform water and power management decisions to minimize the impacts of climate change for Western water. And so, as you mentioned, I'm a hydrologist. I'm obsessed with data. And so a big piece of that is making sure we have the data we need to manage our water resources well, but then also sharing that data. If we're managing shared water resources, whether it's between states or countries, having a shared understanding of how much water we have is really a necessary starting point to have a conversation about how we are going to manage it, particularly under increased uncertainty associated with climate change. And then you also mentioned the White House last year released their action plan on global water security, which was really exciting. It was the first time that a plan of this level was released at the White House level, focused on this access to water and sanitation, kind of the hygiene, water quality piece as a first pillar. Second pillar focused on sustainable water management. And then the third pillar, promoting multilateral action on water security. So really exciting things coming out of the administration, recognizing the urgency of these issues, but then also how they're all interconnected, and water and climate, we need to address them simultaneously.
Absolutely. And while it isn't talked about enough, there does seem to be a bit of momentum and coalescence around the issue, and coming from UN Water last month as well. Claire, I saw you raise the flag. Is there a question from the audience?
Yes, Valerie here in DC is wondering what role you see seawater desalination playing in managing global water security issues, and how countries can ensure these projects limit their environmental harm.
Great question.
The hydrologist.
Obviously, a really important solution in many places where there aren't other options, but usually what I say, I mean, first, we have huge opportunities to increase water efficiency use and reduce our demand for water, and that should be kind of our first step. We should be trying to minimize losses in water and transmission. There's huge losses because desal is really energy intensive. And so we don't want to be making the climate crisis worse while getting the water resources we need. But of course, in some communities, that's the only option. And so I'm excited about new technologies and advancements and trying to make sure that we can do that, as the person who asked the question mentioned, in a way that's more environmentally sustainable. But curious if other folks have thoughts.
No, I would agree. Yeah, that's right. Last resort. And expensive.
Yeah, last resort.
Picking up on what you were mentioning, Annalise, about priorities and policy and action by government, I'd like it to turn it back to you, Sera, and I'm curious, in your interaction in Mexico and also the other governments that you're working with around the world, how are you engaging with them on these issues and ensuring that they're recognizing it's a priority? What is the entry point to prioritize it and have a common understanding of the value and the need to do that work and systematize it as part of surveys and other efforts to inform investments that those governments need to make?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would argue that water security has been invisible for a long time because we haven't been measuring it at the level of the human. But now with these questions we have, like, how often have you been angry about your water situation? How often have you had to change food you eat because of problems with water? That resonates. Like, you don't have to be a hydrologist to understand, like, you don't want your constituents to be experiencing shame or anger about their water situation. And so we've been pretty successful in conveying the extent of the problem. And so we've been collaborating with Gallup World Poll and UNESCO to get nationally representative data on 31 countries. And these are valuable data, and they paint a picture that looks different than if you're looking at the infrastructure. So like at Cairo Water Week, we presented roughly a quarter of Egyptians are water insecure. That's a very different number than you would get if you're evaluating infrastructure. Same in Mexico. And that has really caused pause. I mean, it's not great news, but if you are a political leader, you need to know what you're dealing with. And so it's caused pause, but it's also caused an opportunity for improvement. And we can see that policymakers sort of saying, yes, we can shift this, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember in our conversation that we had preparing for this as well, we were talking about it's a way to establish accountability, but also leadership. Right? And those who are able and willing to move forward, to understand the nature of the problem, the severity of it, and allocate resources then to it. Yeah. I think in our position to establish leadership in that way.
At World Water Week 2 years ago, I think, Zach Goldsmith, who was the British foreign minister for the UK, said, you know, the water insecurity experience scales are a new indicator to hold people accountable. And accountability can be great, and it can be very, very scary. But if we say we value water, we all need to be accountable for it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd like to turn it over to you, Janti, and talk a little bit more about what you see that needs to be done in terms of the investments that are being made and the mechanisms that are being employed. You know, we've talked a lot today about financing, the need for money. That is absolutely clear. The investment gap in water is severe. Mm-hmm. And we were talking as well a little bit about some of the ways in which investments are being made are reactive. That's right. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from your perspective about what more can be done. Yes, responding to the problem and the crisis is absolutely vital, but what more can be done upstream, so to speak, to address those infrastructure issues so that it's more proactive and less reactive in terms of investments? Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, incremental funding is needed, and we are definitely supporting, you know, the president's budget and the ask there, within there, particularly for foreign assistance, as well as for domestic investments, and climate change and water is a part of that. And there's a couple of things outside of incremental funding. There's also, how do we use what we have much better? We know, I mean, it's an old wisdom, right, that an ounce of preparedness is worth whatever, a kilo in response. And it's the same for things like humanitarian response. It's often we see now, we always get the money after the earthquake has happened, the drought has happened, the flood has happened, whatever it is. And we know that if you respond earlier, before it happens, it is usually cheaper, more efficient. If you make sure that not half of healthcare clinics are without water, you prevent much worse health issues down the line that are harder to resolve. Aside from the harm it does to women and children and everybody, it's also cheaper to resolve, to make sure that hygiene is there before people get infected and women and children lose their lives. So there's a lot of, you know, but the prevention narrative is sometimes a really hard sell, publicly, politically, because people think like, well, it hasn't happened yet. So where's the ROI on that investment? Mm-hmm. And somehow so we, all of us, have to do better in making that a much clearer case. Because instinctively, people do understand it. If you invest in that water infrastructure, we still, in humanitarian responses, I still see when Save the Children is always, you know, in a response, we're there, we're responding with everything that kids and their families need. And we still end up water trucking water in. Now, sometimes it's inevitable if the whole infrastructure is destroyed, and yes, you have to do it. And it's the most important thing on our list, because we know waterborne diseases happen. If you don't solve that, then everything else is for naught. But that water trucking sometimes goes on for way too long, unnecessarily. Yeah. Super expensive, really bad for the climate, by the way, very unsustainable, and some upfront investment in rehabilitating the water infrastructure would be better. But sometimes it's not in we have to be better in designing it in purposefully. So those are some of the things. And I think there's also a real role for national governments, not just here, but everywhere. You know, I would herald the decision of the government of Niger recently to make Ministry of Health that essential items for our hospitals and clinics is water and soap. Yeah, it sounds so obvious, but if you don't have that, now, of course, you then need to make sure there's funding, you need to make sure it's implemented. But that is a good signal of the government's taking it more seriously. Mm-hmm.
Sera, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to add something that I see again and again, and that's the siloing of water from other things. Like we see, like the wash people care about wash, and the nutrition people care about nutrition, and so on and so forth. But speaking of data nerds, I mean, what we want to do is connect the water data to the health data, and the water data to the food security data. And we're starting to make the case when we can get to that, then you can talk other people's languages when you're speaking water.
Exactly. So concrete examples. So the humanitarian sector has now been using for a number of years FuseNet effectively. A fantastic investment, thank you USAID and the US government and the Gates Foundation and others to set this up. And it essentially measured food security across the world. So it's super helpful for organizations like ours to know where are kids food insecure and at what grade. So and it becomes a little technical, but then you know when you know where it gets really bad, and it helps you allocate resources better. If we could do a fuse net on water use and water security, that would be massive, and it would have a direct impact on nutrition, on health as well. So the platform is there.
Yeah, and the plausibility of that relationship is now established. We collaborated with Food and Agriculture Organization in a 25-country study and showed that if you are water insecure, you're 2 to 3 times as likely to be food insecure when controlling for all the things that we know shape food insecurity: age, gender, education, income. So,
absolutely. And connecting those dots, we were talking earlier as well about money matters, but there are all of these tools and ability to leverage them that are publicly accessible, free resources that can be leveraged and brought to bear to inform that decision making. And Annalise, I wonder if you could touch on that a bit as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. No, I think you teed it up really nicely. There's such a huge opportunity to take advantage of the amazing expertise we have across the U.S. government. I mean, I work specifically with the U.S. Geological Survey. They have incredible sources of data made publicly available. A lot of it's domestic, but they also have an international program office. They've been working with the Bureau of Reclamation to support the government of Iraq to manage their climate change risk and manage water resources better, helping train their teams to do remote sensing, to manage scarce water resources for a long time. And I think kind of working as a whole of government, working with other partners outside of government, academia, there's such a real opportunity to take advantage of what we already have that actually doesn't cost very much money, and make sure that we're sharing all of the knowledge and the data that we have with partners around the world who might not have access to that sort of information, and that information hopefully can help them start planning proactively and make a case for why they need to do the preventative work, kind of bringing it back to what you were saying at the beginning, so that we can spend a lot less preventatively instead of always just having to clean up the mess afterwards and be more prepared.
Right.
And maybe just one thing on that, when you asked me before about financing, yes, incremental money, there is a real role here, and I think an investable case also for the private sector. You know, and when we talk whole of government, I would certainly mention DFC as an opportunity to say, you know, there could be a real case here to de-risk investment for the private sector. There are SMEs also in countries that are where there is high levels of water insecurity, to make some of these investments, to use some of these technologies that are sometimes they're really locally grown because people have lived in those situations already for years and years, and the reason they're still alive is because they have actually adapted and they have found ways that sometimes we, you know, sitting here not being water insecure, sort of overlook. So I think there's a real opportunity here to use some of that available capital to actually de-risk some of those investments and make a market in addressing some of these issues.
There is a real opportunity, and I'm energized by all three of you and the work that you're doing, and the fact that backstage you're already collaborating on what you can do next, how you can work together, which is just fabulous to see. And you know, the best of what we could hope for coming out of today is more action, more collaboration. And so we're out of time, unfortunately, but one last question to you, Sera, is when you think about those next steps, you know, we're coming up to the next global stock take for the SDGs and scaling the work that you're doing, 31 countries already needing and wanting to expand and determined to do so. What needs to happen next so that there can be a broader utilization of this data to inform water-related security investments and actions going forward?
Well, I'm a big fan of data. It won't surprise you. So, I mean, I would really like to see estimates of people's experiences with water insecurity in all 160 countries in the world. I mean, that's overdue. But I also like to empower people to think about water differently than what we do, so that they themselves are saying, what's happening in my constituency? Are things getting better? Are things getting worse for the people in where I live? Yeah. And if we hold that as the benchmark for water secure or not, we'll be in good shape.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for the work you're doing. Best wishes in the road ahead. And thank you for family members for coming today and for all of you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.